hey, I love to read books, but the old school way is just so inconvenient, lugging this around on the bus, trying to read it at work. There's gotta be a better way. It's the 21st century. Oh, do I got a good audio story for you today. Check it out.
Chapter 5 of The Man Upstairs and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Man Upstairs by P.G.Wodehouse. Chapter 5, By Advice of Counsel. The traveler champed meditatively at his steak. He paid no attention to the altercation which was in progress between the waiter and the man at the other end of the dingy room. The sounds of strife ceased. The waiter came over to the traveler's table and stood behind his chair. The waiter was ruffled. "If he meant lamb," he said querulously, "why didn't he say lamb? Says a fellow could hear him. I thought he said am. So I brought him ham. Now Lord Percy gets all peevish." He laughed bitterly. The traveler made no reply. "If people spoke distinct," said the waiter, "there wouldn't be half the trouble there is in the world. And half the trouble there wouldn't be. I shouldn't be here, for one thing, in this restaurant, I mean." A sigh escaped him. "I shouldn't," he said, "and that's the truth. I should be getting up when I pleased, eating and drinking all I wanted, and carrying on some as in the good old days. You wouldn't think to look at me, would you now, that I was once like the lily of the field?" The waiter was a tall, stringy man who gave the impression of having no spine in that he drooped. He might have been said to resemble a flower, but in no other respect. He had sandy hair, weak eyes set close together, and a day's growth of red stubble on his chin. One could not see him in the lily class. "What I mean to say is I didn't toil, neither did I spin. Them was the happy days, lying on my back, plenty of tobacco, something cool in a jug." He sighed once more. "Did you ever know a man of the name of Moore? Jerry Moore?" The traveller applied himself to his steak in silence. "Nice feller, simple sort of feller. Big, quiet, bit deaf in one ear, straw-coloured hair, blue eyes. Handsome, rather. Had a house just outside of Reigate, has it still. Money of his own, left him by his pa. Simple sort of fellow, not much to say for himself. I used to know him well in them days. Used to live with him. Nice feller he was, big. Bit hard of hearing, got a sleepy kind of grin, like this or something." The traveller sipped his beer in thoughtful silence. "I reckon you never met him," said the waiter. "Maybe you never knew Gentleman Bailey either. We always called him that. He was one of those broken-down eatin' or adder fellas, folks said. We struck up a partnership, kind of casual, both being on the tramp together. And after a while we happened to be around about Reigate. And the first house we come to was this Jerry Moore's. He come up just as we were sliding to the back door and grinned that sleepy grin like this or something. 'Hello,' he said. Gentleman kind of gives a whoop and hollers, 'If it ain't my old pal, Jerry Moore. Jack,' he says to me, 'this is me old pal, Mr. Jerry Moore, what I met in happier days down at Ramsgate one summer.' They shake hands, and Jerry Moore says, 'Is this a friend of yours, Bailey?' Looking at me, gentleman introduces me. 'We are partners,' he says, 'partners in misfortune. This is my friend, Mr. Roach.' 'Oh, come along in,' says Jerry. So we went on in, and he makes us at home. He's a bachelor and lives all by himself in this desirable house. Well, I seen pretty quick that Jerry thinks the world of gentlemen. All that evening he's acting as pleased as Punch to have him there. Couldn't do enough for him. It was a bit of all right, I said to myself. It was, too. Next day we gets up late and has a good breakfast, sits on the lawn, smokes. The sun was shining, the little birds were singing, and there wasn't a thing, east, west, north, or south, that looked like work. If I'd been asked my address at that moment, on oath, I couldn't have hesitated a second. I should have answered, Number 1, Easy Street. You see, Jerry Moore was one of these slow, simple fellers, and you could tell in a moment what a lot he thought of gentlemen. Gentlemen, you see, had a way with him. Not haughty, he wasn't. More affable, I should call it. He sort of made you feel that all men are born equal, but that it was awful good of him to be talking to you, and that he wouldn't do it for everybody. It went down proper with Jerry Moore. Jerry would sit and listen to him, giving his views on things by the hour. By the end of the first day, I was having visions of sitting in that garden, a white-baked old man, and being laid out when my time should come in Jerry's front room. He paused, his mind evidently in the past, among the cigars and big breakfasts. Presently he took up his tale. You see, Jerry Moore was a simple sort of fella. Deafies are like that. Ever noticed? Not that Jerry was a real deafy. His hearing was a bit off, but he could follow you if you spoke to him nice and clear. Well, I was saying he was kind of simple, like to put in his days pottering about the little garden he'd made for himself, looking after his flowers and his fowls, and sitting of an evening listening to gentlemen holding forth on life. He was a philosopher, gentleman was, and Jerry took everything he said as gospel. Didn't want no proofs. He and the King of Denmark would have been great pals. He just sat by with his big blue eyes getting rounder every minute and lapping it up. Now, you'd think a man like that could be counted on, wouldn't you? Would he want anything more? Not he, you'd say. Well, you'd be wrong. Believe me, there isn't a man on earth that's fixed and contented, but what's a woman can't knock his old paradise into ash with one punch. It wasn't long before I began to notice a change in Jerry. He never had been what you'd call a champion catch-as-catch-can talker, but now he was silenter than ever, and he got a habit of switching gentlemen off from his theories of life in general to woman in particular. Now, this suited gentlemen just right. What he didn't know about woman wasn't knowledge. Gentleman was too busy talking to have time to get suspicious, but I wasn't, and one day I draws gentleman aside and puts it to him straight. Gentlemen, I says, Jerry Moore is in love. Well, this was a nasty knock, of course, for gentlemen. He knew as well as I did what it would mean if Jerry was to lead home a blushing bride through that front door. It would be outside into the cold, hard work for the bachelor friends. Gentleman sees that quick, and his jaw drops. I goes on. All the time, I says, that you're talking away of an evening, Jerry's seeing visions of a little woman sitting in your chair. And you can bet you don't enter into them visions. He may dream a little feet pattern about the house, I says, but they ain't ours. And you can have something on that both ways. Look alive, gentlemen, I says, and think out some plan, or we might as well be padding the hoof right now. Well, gentleman did what he could. In his evening discourses, he started to give it to woman all he knew, began to talk about Delilahs and Jezebels and fools there was and the rest of it, and what a mug a feller was to let a female into his cozy house. It'd only make him spend his days hooking her up, and his nights wondering how to get back to blankets without waking her. My, he was crisp, enough to have given Romeo the jumps, he'd have thought, but Lord, it's no good talking to them when they've had it bad. A few days later, we caught him with the goods, talking in the road to a girl in a pink dress. I couldn't but admit that Jerry had picked one right from the top of the basket. This wasn't one of them languishing sort of what sits about in cozy corners and reads storybooks, and don't care what's happening in the home so long as they find out what became of the hero in his duel with the Grand Duke. She was a brown, slim, wiry-looking little thing. You know, you held her chin up and looked you up and down with eyes the color of Scotch whiskey, as much as to say, well, what about it? You could tell without looking at her, just by the feel of the atmosphere and she was near, that she had as much snap and go in her as Jerry Moore hadn't, which was a good bit. I knew, just as sure as I was standing there on one leg, that this was the sort of girl who would have me and gentlemen out of that house about 3 seconds after the clergyman had tied the knot. Jerry says, these are my friends, Miss Tuxton, Mr. Bailey and Mr. Roach. They're staying with me for a visit. This is Miss Jane Tuxton, he says to me. I was just going to see Miss Tuxton home, he says, sort of wistful. Excellent, says gentleman, we'll come too. And we all goes along. There wasn't much done in the way of conversation. Jerry never was one for pushing out the words, nor was I when in the presence of the sext. And Miss Jane had her chin in the air as if she thought me and gentleman was not needed in any way whatsoever. The only talk before we turned her in at the garden gate was done by a gentleman who told a pretty long story about a friend of his in Upper Sydenham who'd been silly enough to marry and had trouble ever since. That night, after we went to bed, I said to Gentlemen, I said, what's going to be done about this? We've got about as much chance if Jerry marries that girl, I says, as a couple of helpless chocolate creams at a schoolgirl's picnic. If, says Gentleman, he ain't married her yet. That's a girl of character, Jack, trust me. Didn't she strike you as a girl who'd like a man with a bit of a devil in him, a man with some go in him, a you-be-darned kind of man? Oh, does Jerry fill that bill? He's more like a doormat with welcome written on it than anything else. Well, we've seen a good deal of Miss Jane in the next week or so. We kept Jerry under, what's it the heroine says in the melodrama? Oh, cruel SP something. Oh, espionage. That's it. So he keeps Jerry under espionage, and whenever he goes trickling round after the girl, we goes trickling round after him. Things is running our way, says Gentleman to me after one of these meetings. That girl's getting cross with Jerry. She wants Reckless Rudolph, not a man who stands and grins when other men butt in on him and his girl. Mark my words, Jack, she'll get tired of Jerry and go off and marry a soldier, and we live happy ever after. Think so, I said. No, sure of it, says Gentleman. Well, it was the Sunday after this that Jerry Moore announces to us, wriggling, that he had an engagement to take supper with Jane and her folks. He'd have liked to have slipped away secret, but we was keeping him under espionage too crisp for that, so he has to tell us. Oh, excellent, said Gentleman. It'll be a great treat to Jack and myself to meet the family. We'll go along with you. So off we all goes and pushes our boots in sociable fashion under the Tuxton table. I looked at Miss Jane out of the corner of my eye, and honest, that chin of hers was sticking out a foot, and Jerry didn't dare look at her. Love's young dream, I mused to myself, how swift it fades when a man has the nature and disposition of a lop-eared rabbit. The Tuxtons was 4 in number, not counting the parrot, and all male. There was Pa Tuxton, an old fellow with a beard and glasses, a fat uncle, a big brother who worked in a bank and was dressed like Moses in all his glory, and a little brother with a snub nose, that cheeky you'd have been surprised. Oh, and the parrot in its cage, and a fat yellow dog. And they're all making themselves pleasant to Jerry, the wealthy future son-in-law. Something awful. It's how are the fowls, Mr. Moore, and a little bit of this pie, Mr. Moore. Jane made it, and Jerry sitting there with a feeble grin saying yes and no and nothing much more, while Miss Jane's eyes are snapping like 5th of November fireworks. I could feel Jerry's chances going back a mile a minute. I felt as happy as a little child that evening. I sang going back home. Gentleman's pleased, too. Jack, he says to me when we're in bed, this is too easy. In my most sanguinary dreams, I hardly hoped for this. No girl of spirit's going to love a man who behaves that way to her parents. The way to win the heart of a certain type of girl, he said, beginning on his theories, the type to which Jane Tuxton belongs, is to be rude to her family. I've got Jane Tuxton sized up and labeled. Her kind wants her folks to dislike a young man. She wants to feel that she's the only one in the family who's got the sense to see the hidden good in Willie. She doesn't want to be one of a crowd hollering out what a nice young man he is. It takes some pluck in a man to stand up to a girl's family, and that's what Jane Tuxton is looking for in Jerry. Take it from one who has studied the sect, says Gentleman, from John o' Groats to Land's End and back again. Well, next day, Jerry Moore's looking as if he'd only 6pence in the world and had swallowed it. What's the matter, Jerry? Says Gentleman. Jerry heaves a sigh. Bailey, he says, and you, Mr. Roach, I expect you both seen how it is with me. I love Miss Jane Tuxton, and you've seen for yourself what transpires. She don't value me, not 2pence. Say not so, says Gentleman, sympathetic. You're doing fine. If you knew the sect as I do, you wouldn't go by mere superficial silences and chin-tiltings. I can read a girl's heart, Jerry, he says, patting him on the shoulder. And I'll tell you, you're doing fine. All you want now is a little rapid work and you win easy to make the thing assert, he says, getting up. All you have to do is make a dead set at her folks, he winks at me. Don't just sit there like you did last night. Show 'em you've got something in you. You know what folks are. They think themselves the most important things on the map. Well, go to work. Consult them all you know every opportunity you get. There's nothing like consulting a girl's folks to put you in a good with her. And he pats Jerry on the shoulder again and goes indoors to find his pipe. Jerry turns to me. That's really so, he said. I say, I do. He knows all about girls, I reckon, says Jerry. You can go by him every time, I says. Well, says Jerry, sort of thoughtful. The waiter paused. His eyes were sad and dreamy. Then he took up the burden of his tale. First thing that happens is the gentleman has a sore tooth on the next Sunday, so don't feel like coming along with us. He sits at home dosing it with whiskey, and Jerry and me goes off alone. So Jerry and me pikes off, and once more we prepares to settle down round the board. I hadn't noticed Jerry particular, but just now I catch a sight of his face in the light of the lamp. Ever see one of those fighters when he's sitting in his corner before a fight, waiting for the gong to go? Well, Jerry looks just like that, and it surprises me. I told you about the fat yellow dog that permeated the Tuxton's house, didn't I? The family thought a lot of that dog, thought of all the ugly brutes I ever met he was the worst. Sniffing around and growling all the time. Well, this evening he comes up to Jerry just as he's going to sit down and starts to growl. Old Pa Tuxton looks over his glasses and licks his tongue. "Rover, Rover," he says, kind of mild. "Naughty Rover." He don't like strangers, I'm afraid. Jerry looks at Pa Tuxton and he looks at the dog, and I'm just expecting to say no or yes. Same as the other night when he lets out a nasty laugh, one of them bitter laughs. "Huh," he says. "Oh, don't he? And perhaps he'd better get farther away from them." And he ups with his boot, and, well, the dog hit the far wall. Jerry sits down and pulls up his chair. "I don't approve," he said, fierce, "of folks keeping great, big, ugly, bad-tempered yellow dogs that are a nuisance to all. I don't like it." There was a silence you could have scooped out with a spoon. Have you ever had a rabbit turn round on you and growl? Well, that's how we all felt when Jerry outs with them crisp words. They took our breath away. While we were getting it back again, the parrot, which was in its cage, let out a squawk. Honest, I jumped a foot in my chair. Jerry gets up, very deliberate, and walks over to the parrot. "Is this a menagerie?" he says. "Can't a man have supper in peace without an image like you starting to holler? Go to sleep." We was all staring at him, surprised, especially Uncle Dick Tuxton, whose particular pet the parrot was. He'd brought him home all the way from some foreign parts. "Hello, Billy," said the bird, shrugging his shoulders and puffing himself up. "Hello, Billy, lo-lo-lo-ro-wah." Jerry gives its cage a bang. "Don't talk back to me," he says, "or I'll knock your head off. You think because you got a green tail you're someone." And he stalks back to his chair and sits glaring at Uncle Dick. Well, this wasn't what you might call promoting an easy flow of conversation. Everyone's looking at Jerry, especially me, wondering what next, and trying to get their breath, and Jerry's frowning at the cold beef, and there's a sort of awkward pause. Miss Jane is the first to get busy. She bustles about and gets the food served out, and we begins to eat. But still, there's not so much conversation that you'd notice it. This goes on till we reaches the concluding stages, and then Uncle Dick comes up to the scratch. "How's the fowls, Mr. Moore?" he says. "Give me some more pie," says Jerry. "What?" Uncle Dick repeats his remark. "Fowls," says Jerry. "What do you know about fowls? The notion of a fowl is an ugly bird with a green tail, a Wellington nose, and... Give me a bit of cheese." Uncle Dick's fond of the parrot, so he speaks up for him. "Polly's always been reckoned a handsome bird," he said. "He wants stuffing," says Jerry. And Uncle Dick drops out of the talk. Up comes big brother, Ralph, his name was. He's the bank clerk and a dude. He gives his cuffs a flick and starts in to make things jolly all round by telling a story about a man he knows named Wotherspoon. Jerry fixes him with his eye, and halfway through he interrupts. "That waistcoat of yours is fierce," he says. "Pardon?" says Ralph. "That waistcoat of yours," says Jerry, "it hurts my eyes. It's like an electric sign." "Why, Jerry," I said, but he just scowls at me and I stop. Ralph is proud of his clothes, and he isn't going to stand for this. He glares at Jerry, and Jerry glares at him. "Who do you think you are?" said Ralph, breathing hard. "Button up your coat," says Jerry. "Look here," says Ralph. "Cover it up, I tell you," says Jerry. "Do you want to blind me?" Pa Tuxton interrupts. "Why, Mr. Moore," he begins, sort of soothing, when the small brother who's been staring at Jerry chips in. I told you he was cheeky. He says, "Pa, what a funny nose Mr. Moore's got." And that did it. Jerry rises very slow and leans across the table and clips the kid brother one side of the ear-hole. And then there's a general imbroglio, everyone standing up and the kid hollering and the dog barking. "If you'd brought him up better," said Jerry, severe to Pa Tuxton, "this would never have happened." Pa Tuxton gives a sort of howl. "Mr. Moore," he yells, "what is the meaning of this extraordinary behavior? You come here and strike me child." Jerry bangs on the table. "Yes," he says, and I'd strike him again. Listen to me. You think just because I'm quiet I ain't got no spirit. You think all I can do is sit and smile. You think, bah. You aren't onto the hidden depths of me character. I'm one of them still waters that runs deep. Here, you get out of it. Yes, all of you except Jane. Jane and me wants this room to have a private talk in. I've got a lot of things to say to Jane. Are you going? I turns to the crowd. I was awful disturbed. You mustn't take any notice, I says. He ain't well. He ain't himself. When just then the parrot cuts with another of them squawks, Jerry jumps at it. You first, he says, and flings the cage out of the window. Now you, he says to the yellow dog, putting him out through the door. And then he folds his arms and scowls at us, and we all notice suddenly that he's very big. We look at one another, and we begins to edge towards the door, all except Jane, who's staring at Jerry as if he's a ghost. Mr. Moore, said Pa Tuxton, dignified, we'll leave you. You're drunk. Oh, I'm not drunk, says Jerry. I'm in love. Jane, says Pa Tuxton, come with me and leave this ruffian to himself. Jane, says Jerry, stop here and come and lay your head on my shoulder. Jane, says Pa Tuxton, do you hear me? Jane, says Jerry, I'm waiting. She looks from one to the other for a spell, then she moves to where Jerry's standing. I'll stop, she says, sort of quiet. And we drifts out. The waiter snorted. I got back home as quick as I could and relates the proceedings to gentlemen. Gentlemen's rattled. I don't believe it, he says. Don't stand there and tell me Jerry Moore did them things. Why, it ain't in the man. Especially after what I said to him about the way he ought to behave. How could he have done so? Just then in comes Jerry, beaming all over. Boys, he shouts, congratulates me. It's all right. We've fixed it up. She says she hadn't known me properly before. She says she'd always reckoned me a sheep. Well, all the time I was one of them strong, silent men. He turns to gentlemen. The man at the other end of the room was calling for his bill. All right, said the waiter, coming. He turns to gentlemen, he went on rapidly, and he says, Bailey, I owe it all to you, because if you hadn't told me to insult her folks... He leaned on the traveler's table and fixed him with an eye that pleaded for sympathy. How about that, he said. Isn't that crisp? Insult her folks. Them was his very words, insult her folks. The traveler looked at him inquiringly. Can you beat it, said the waiter. I don't know what you're saying, said the traveler. If it is important, write it on a slip of paper. I am stone deaf. End of Chapter 5, by advice of counsel, recording by Mike Harris. Chapter 6 of The Man Upstairs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Man Upstairs by P.G.Wodehouse. Chapter number 6. Rough-Hew them how we will. Paul Boyle was a waiter. The word waiter suggests a soft-voiced, deft-handed being, moving swiftly and without noise in an atmosphere of luxury and shaded lamps. At Breden's Parisian Cafe and Restaurant in Soho, London, where Paul worked, there were none of these things. And Paul himself, though he certainly moved swiftly, was by no means noiseless. His progress through the room resembled in almost equal proportions the finish of a marathon race, the star act of a professional juggler, and a monologue by an Earl's Court sideshowman. Constant acquaintance rendered regular habitués callous to the wonder, but to a stranger, the sight of Paul tearing over the difficult between-tables course, his hands loaded with two vast pyramids of dishes, shouting as he went the mystic single word, coming in a moment, sir, steaks, yes, are coming, was impressive to a degree. For doing far less exacting feats on the stage, music hall performers were being paid £50 a week. Paul got 18 shillings. But what a blessing is poverty, properly considered. If Paul had received more than 18 shillings a week, he would not have lived in an attic. He would have luxuriated in a bed-sitting room on the second floor, and would consequently have missed what was practically a genuine north light. The skylight which went with the attic was so arranged that the room was a studio in miniature, and as Paul was engaged in his spare moments in painting a great picture, nothing could have been more fortunate. For Paul, like so many of our public men, lived two lives. Off-duty, the sprinting, barking juggler of Breden's Parisian Cafe became the quiet follower of art. Ever since his childhood, he had had a passion for drawing and painting. He regretted that fate had allowed him so little time for such work, but after all, he reflected, all great artists had had their struggles, so why not he? Moreover, they were now nearly at an end. An hour here, an hour there, and every Thursday a whole afternoon, and the great picture was within measurable distance of completion. He had won through, without models, without leisure. Hungry, tired, he had nevertheless triumphed. A few more touches and the masterpiece would be ready for purchase. And after that, all would be plain sailing. Paul could forecast the scene so exactly. The picture would be at the dealer's, possibly. One must not be too sanguine. Thrust away in some odd corner, the wealthy connoisseur would come in. At first, he would not see the masterpiece. Other, more prominently displayed works would catch his eye. He would turn from them in weary scorn, and then Paul wondered how big the check would be. There were definitely reasons why he wanted the money. Looking at him as he cantered over the linoleum at Braddon's, you would have said that his mind was on his work, but it was not so. He took and executed orders as automatically as the penny in the slot music box in the corner took pennies and produced tunes. His thoughts were of Jean Lebrock, his co-worker at Braddon, and a little cigar shop down Brixton Way, which he knew was in the market at a reasonable rate. To marry the former and own the latter was Paul's idea of the earthly paradise, and it was the wealthy connoisseur, and he alone, who could open the gates. Jeanne was a large, slow-moving Norman girl, stolidly handsome. One could picture her in a de Maupassant farmyard. In the clatter and bustle of Braddon's Parisian cafe, she appeared out of place, rather like a cow in a boiler factory. To Paul, who worshipped her with all the fervor of a little man for a large woman, her deliberate methods seemed all that was beautiful and dignified. To his mind, she lent a tone to the vulgar whirlpool of gorging humanity, as if she had been some goddess mixing in a Homeric battle. The whirlpool had other views, and expressed them. One coarse-fibred brute, indeed, once went so far as to address to her the frightful words, "Hurry up there, Totty, look stippy." It was wrong, of course, for Paul to slip and spill an order of scrambled eggs down the brute's coat sleeve, but who, after all, can blame him? Among those who did not see eye to eye with Paul in his views on deportment in waitresses was Monsieur Braddon himself, the owner of the Parisian cafe, and it was this circumstance which first gave Paul the opportunity of declaring the passion which was gnawing him with the fierce fury of a Braddon customer gnawing a tough steak against time during the rush hour. He had long worshipped her from afar, but nothing more intimate than a "Good morning, Miss Jeanne" had escaped him, till one day during a slack spell he came upon her in the little passage leading to the kitchen, her face hidden in her apron, her back jerking with sobs. Business is business. Paul had a message to deliver to the cook respecting 2 fried coffee and 1 stale. He delivered it and returned. Jean was still sobbing. "Ah, Miss Jeanne," cried Paul, stricken. "What is the matter? What is it? Why do you weep?" "The patron," sobbed Jane. He... "My angel," said Paul, "he is a pig." This was perfectly true. No conscientious judge of character could have denied that Paul had hit the bullseye. Braddon was a pig. He looked like a pig, he ate like a pig, he grunted like a pig, he had the lavish embonpoint of a pig. Also a porcine soul. If you had tied a bit of blue ribbon round his neck, you could certainly have won prizes with him at a show. Paul's eyes flashed with fury. "I will slap him in the eye," he roared. "He called me a tortoise." "And kick him in the stomach," added Paul. Jean's sobs were running on second speed now. The anguish was diminishing. Paul took advantage of the improved conditions to slide an arm part of the way round her waist. In 2 minutes he had said as much as the ordinary man could have worked off in 10. All good stuff, too. No padding. Jean's face rose from her apron like a full moon. She was too astounded to be angry. Paul continued to babble. Jean looked at him with growing wrath. That she, who received daily the affectionate badinage of gentlemen in bowler hats and check suits, who had once been invited to the White City by a solicitor's clerk, should be addressed in this way by a waiter. It was too much. She threw off his hand. "Wretched little man," she cried, stamping angrily. "My angel," protested Paul. Jean uttered a scornful laugh. "You," she said. There are a few more withering remarks than you, spoken in a certain way. Jean spoke it just that way. Paul wilted. On 18 shillings a week, went on Jean satirically. You would support a wife, yes? Right. Paul recovered himself. He had an opening now and proceeded to use it. Listen, he said, at present, yes, it is true, I earn but 18 shillings a week. But it will not always be so, no. I am not only a waiter, I am also an artist. I have painted a great picture. For a whole year I have worked, and now it is ready. I will sell it, and then, my angel. Jean's face had lost some of its scorn. Jean was listening with some respect. A picture, she said thoughtfully. There is money in pictures. For the first time, Paul was glad that his arm was no longer round her waist. To do justice to the great work, he needed both hands for purposes of gesticulation. There is money in this picture, he said. Oh, it is beautiful. I call it The Awakening. It's a woodland scene. I come back from my work where hot and tired, and a mere glance at that wood refreshes me. It's so cool, so green. The sun filters in golden splashes through the foliage. On a mossy bank between two trees lies a beautiful girl asleep. Above her, bending fondly over her, just about to kiss that flower-like face, is a young man in the dress of a shepherd. At the last moment he has looked over his shoulder to make sure that there is nobody near to see. He is wearing an expression so happy, so proud, that one's heart goes out to him. Yes, there might be money in that, cried Jean. There is, cried Paul. I shall sell it for many francs to a wealthy connoisseur. And then, my angel. You are a good little man, said the angel patronizingly. Perhaps. Peut-être. We will see. Paul caught her hand and kissed it. She smiled indulgently. Yes, she said, there might be money. These English pay much money for pictures. It is pretty generally admitted that Geoffrey Chaucer, the eminent poet of the 14th century, though obsessed with an almost Rooseveltian passion for the new spelling, was there with the goods when it came to profundity of thought. It was Chaucer who wrote the lines, "The life so short, the craft so long to learn, the essay so hard, so sharp are the conquering," which means broadly that it's difficult to paint a picture, but a great deal more difficult to sell it. Across the centuries, Paul Bowles shook hands with Geoffrey Chaucer. So sharp are the conquering put his case in a nutshell. The full story of his wanderings with the masterpiece would read like an Odyssey and be about as long. It shall definitely be condensed. There was an artist who dined at intervals at Bredon's Parisian Café, and as the artistic temperament was too impatient to be suited by Jean's leisurely methods, it had failed to Paul to wait upon him. It was to this expert that Paul, emboldened by the geniality of the artist's manner, went for information. How did Monsieur sell his pictures? Monsieur said he didn't, except once in a blue moon. But when he did, he took the thing to the dealers. Paul thanked him. A friend of him, he explained, had painted a picture and wished to sell it. Poor devil, was the artist's comment. Next day, it happened to be a Thursday, Paul started on his travels. He started buoyantly, but by evening he was as a punctured balloon. Every dealer had the same remark to make, to wit, no room. "Have you sold the picture?" inquired Jean when they met. "Not yet," said Paul, "but there are delicate matters, these negotiations. I use finesse, I proceed with caution." He approached the artist again. "With the dealers," he said, "my friend has been a little unfortunate. They say they have no room." "I know," said the artist, nodding. "Is there perhaps another way?" "And what sort of picture is it?" inquired the artist. Paul became enthusiastic. "Ah, monsieur, it is beautiful. It is a woodland scene, a beautiful girl. Oh. Then he had better try the magazines. They might use it for a cover." Paul thanked him effusively. On the following Thursday he visited diverse art editors. The art editors seemed to be in the same unhappy condition as the dealers. "Overstocked," was their cry. "The picture," said Jean on the Friday morning, "is it sold?" "Not yet," said Paul, "but—" "Always but, my angel." "Bah," said Jean with a toss of her large but shapely head. By the end of the month, Paul was fighting in the last ditch, wandering disconsolately among those who dwell in outer darkness and have grimy thumbs. 7 of these in all he visited on that Black Thursday, and each of the 7 rubbed the surface of the painting with a grimy thumb, snorted, and dismissed him. Sick and beaten, Paul took the masterpiece back to his skylight room. All that night he lay awake thinking. It was a weary bundle of nerves that came to the Parisian cafe next morning. He was late in arriving, which was good, in that it delayed the inevitable question as to the fate of the picture, but bad in every other respect. Monsieur Bredin, squatting behind the cash desk, grunted fiercely at him, and worse, Jean, who owing to his absence had to be busier than suited her disposition, was distant and haughty. A murky gloom settled upon Paul. Now it so happened that Monsieur Bredin, when things went well with him, was wont to be filled with a ponderous amiability. It was not often that this took a practical form, though it is on record that in an exuberant moment he once gave a small boy a halfpenny. More frequently it merely led him to soften the porcine austerity of his demeanor. Today, business having been uncommonly good, he felt pleased with the world. He had left his cash desk and was assailing a bowl of soup at one of the side tables. Except for a belated luncher at the end of the room, the place was empty. It was one of the hours when there was a lull in the proceedings at the Parisian cafe. Paul was leaning, wrapped in the gloom, against the wall. Jean was waiting on the proprietor. Monsieur Bredin finished his meal and rose. He felt content. All was well with the world. As he lumbered to his desk, he passed Jean. He stopped. He wheezed a compliment, then another. Paul, from his place by the wall, watched with jealous fury. Monsieur Bredin chucked Jean under the chin. As he did so, the belated luncher called, "Waiter!" but Paul was otherwise engaged. His entire nervous system seemed to have been stirred up with a pole. With a hoarse cry, he dashed forward. He would destroy this pig who chucked his Jean under the chin. The first intimation Monsieur Bredin had of the declaration of war was the impact of a French roll on his ear. It was one of those knobbly, chunky rolls with sharp corners, almost as deadly as a piece of shrapnel. Monsieur Bredin was incapable of jumping, but he uttered a howl, and his vast body quivered like a stricken jelly. A second roll, whizzing by, slapped against the wall. A moment later, a cream bun burst in sticky ruin on the proprietor's left eye. The belated luncher had been anxious to pay his bill and go, but he came swiftly to the conclusion that this was worth stopping on for. He leaned back in his chair and watched. Monsieur Bredin had entrenched himself behind the cash desk, peering nervously at Paul through the cream, and Paul, pouring forth abuse in his native tongue, was brandishing a chocolate eclair. The situation looked good to the spectator. It was spoiled by Jean, who seized Paul by the arm and shook him, adding her own voice to the babble. It was enough. The eclair fell to the floor. Paul's voice died away. His face took on again its crushed, haunted expression. The voice of Monsieur Bredin, freed from competition, rose shrill and wrathful. "The marksman is getting sacked," mused the onlooker, diagnosing the situation. He was right. The next moment, Paul, limp and depressed, had retired to the kitchen passage, discharged. It was here, after a few minutes, that Jean found him. "Fool, idiot, imbecile," said Jean. Paul stared at her without speaking. "To throw rolls at the patron, imbecile. He... Bah! And what if he did? Must you then attack him like a mad dog? What is it to you?" Paul was conscious of a dull longing for sympathy, a monstrous sense of oppression. Everything was going wrong. Surely Jean must be touched by his heroism, but no. She was scolding furiously. Suppose Andromeda had turned and scolded Perseus after he had slain the sea monster? Paul mopped his forehead with his napkin. The bottom had dropped out of his word. "Jean!" "Bah! Do not talk to me, idiot of a little man. Almost you lost me my place also. The patron was in two minds, but I coaxed him. A fine thing that would have been to lose my good place through your foolishness. To throw rolls. My goodness!" She swept back into the room again, leaving Paul still standing by the kitchen door. Something seemed to have snapped inside him. How long he stood there he did not know, but presently from the dining room came calls of "Waiter," and automatically he felt once more into his work, as an actor takes up his part. A stranger would have noticed nothing remarkable in him. He bustled to and fro with undiminished energy. At the end of the day, Monsieur Breton paid him his 18 shillings with a grunt, and Paul walked out of the restaurant a masterless man. He went to his attic and sat down on the bed. Propped up against the wall was the picture. He looked at it with unseeing eyes. He stared dully before him. Then thoughts came to him with a rush, leaping and dancing in his mind like imps in Hades. He had a curious sense of detachment. He seemed to be watching himself from a great distance. This was the end. The little imps danced and leaped, and then one separated itself from the crowd, to grow bigger than the rest, to pirouette more energetically. He rose. His mind was made up. He would kill himself. He went downstairs and out into the street. He thought hard as he walked. He would kill himself, but how? His preoccupation was so great that an automobile rounding a corner missed him by inches as he crossed the road. The chauffeur shouted angrily at him as he leapt back. Paul shook his fist at the retreating lights. "Pig!" he shouted. "Assassin! Scoundrel! Villain! Would you kill me? I will take your number, rascal! I will inform the police! Villain!" A policeman had strolled up and was eyeing him curiously. Paul turned to him, full of his wrong. "Officer," he cried, "I have a complaint. These pigs of chauffeurs, they are reckless. They drive so recklessly, hence the great number of accidents." "Awful," said the policeman. "Pass along, sonny." Paul walked on, fuming. It was abominable that these chauffeurs... And then an idea came to him. He had found a way. It was quiet in the park. He had chosen the park because it was dark, and there would be none to see and interfere. He waited long in the shadow by the roadside. Presently, from the darkness, there came the distant drone of powerful engines. Lights appeared like the blazing eyes of a dragon swooping down to devour its prey. He ran out into the road with a shout. It was an error, that shout. He had intended it for an inarticulate farewell to his picture, to Jean, to life. It was excusable to the driver of the motor that he misinterpreted it. It seemed to him a cry of warning. There was a great jarring of brakes, a scuttering of locked wheels on the dry road, and the car came to a standstill a full yard from where he stood. "What the deuce?" said a cool voice from behind the lights. Paul struck his chest and folded his arms. "I am here," Paul cried. "Destroy me." "Let George do it," said the voice in a marked American accent. "I never murdered on a Friday. It's unlucky. If it's not a rude question, which asylum are you from? Hello?" The exclamation was one of surprise, for Paul's nerves had finally given way, and he was now in a heap on the road, sobbing. The man climbed down and came into the light. He was a tall young man with a pleasant, clean-cut face. He stopped and shook Paul. "Quit that," he said. "Maybe it's not true. And if it is, there's always hope. Cut it out. What's the matter? All in?" Paul sat up, gulping convulsively. He was thoroughly unstrung. The cold, desperate mood had passed. In its place came the old feeling of desolation. He was a child aching for sympathy. He wanted to tell his troubles. Punctuating his narrative with many gestures and an occasional gulp, he proceeded to do so. And the American listened attentively. "So you can't sell your picture, and you've lost your job, and your girl is shaking you?" He said, "Yeah, that's pretty bad. But still, you've no call to go mingling with automobile wheels. You come along with me to my hotel, and tomorrow we'll see if we can't fix something up." Well, there was breakfast at the hotel the next morning, a breakfast to put heart into a man. During the meal, a messenger dispatched in a cab to Paul's lodgings returned with the canvas. The deferential waiter informed the American that it had been taken with every possible care to his suite. "Good," said the young man. "If you're through, we'll go and have a look at it." They went upstairs. There was the picture resting against a chair. "Why, I call that fine," said the young man. "It's a crackerjack." Paul's heart gave a sudden leap. Could it be that here was the wealthy connoisseur? He was wealthy, for he drove an automobile and lived in an expensive hotel. He was a connoisseur, for he had said that the picture was crackerjack. "Monsieur is kind," murmured Paul. "It's a bear cat," said the young man, admiringly. "Monsieur is flattering," said Paul, dimly perceiving a compliment. "I've been looking for a picture like that," said the young man, "for months." Paul's eyes rolled heavenwards. "If you'll make a few alterations, I'll buy it and ask for more." "Alterations, monsieur?" "One or two small ones." He pointed to the stooping figure of the shepherd. Now, you see, this prominent citizen, what's he doing? Why, he is stooping, said Paul fervently, to bestow upon his loved one a kiss, and she sleeping all unconscious, dreaming of it. Never mind about her. Fix your mind on him. Willie is the star in the show. You've summed him up accurately. He is stooping. Stooping good. Now, if that fellow was wearing braces and stooped like that, you'd say, he'd burst those braces, wouldn't you? With a somewhat dazed air, Paul said that he thought he would. Till now, he had not looked at the figure from just that viewpoint. You'd say he'd bust them. Well, assuredly, monsieur. No, said the young man solemnly, tapping him earnestly on the chest. That's where you're wrong. Not if they were Galloway's tried and proven. Galloway's tried and proven will stand any old strain you care to put on them. See small bills, wear Galloway's tried and proven, and fate cannot touch you. You can take it from me, I'm the company's general manager. Indeed, monsieur. And I'll make a proposition to you. Cut out that mossy bank and make the girl lying in a hammock. Put Willie in shirt sleeves instead of a bathrobe, and fix him up with a pair of the tried and proven, and I'll give you $3,000 for that picture and a retaining fee for $4,000 a year to work for us and nobody else for any number of years you care to mention. You've got the goods. You've got just the touch. That happy look on Willie's face, for instance, you can see in a minute why he's so happy. It's because he's wearing the tried and proven, and he knows that however far he stoops, they won't break. Is that a deal? Paul's reply left no room for doubt. Seizing the young man firmly round the waist, he kissed him with extreme fervor on both cheeks. Here, here, break away, cried the astonished general manager. That's no way to sign a business contract. It was about 5 minutes after 1 that afternoon that Constable Thomas Parsons, patrolling his beat, was aware of a man motioning to him from the doorway of Breden's Parisian cafe and restaurant. The man looked like a pig. He grunted like a pig. He had the lavish embonpoint of a pig. Constable Parsons suspected that he had a porcine soul. Indeed, the thought flitted across Constable Parsons' mind that if he were to tie a bit of blue ribbon round his neck, he could win prizes with him at a show. What's all this? He inquired, halting. The stout man talked volubly in French. Constable Parsons shook his head. Talk sense, he advised. In there, cried the stout man, pointing behind him into the restaurant. A man, how you say? Yes, sacked. An employee whom I yesterday sacked. Today he returns. I say to him, Cochon, va. What's that? I say, pig, go. How you say? Yes, pop off, I say. Pig, pop off. But he sits and will not go. Come in, officer, and expel him. With a massive dignity, the policeman entered the restaurant. At one of the tables sat Paul, calm and distrait. From across the room, Jean stared freezingly. All right, what's all this? Inquired Constable Parsons. Paul looked up. I too, Paul admitted, I cannot understand. Figure to yourself, monsieur. I entered this cafe to lunch, and this man here would expel me. He is an employee whom I myself have but yesterday dismissed, vociferated Monsieur Breden. He has no money to lunch at my restaurant. The policeman eyed Paul sternly. That so? You'd better come along. Paul's eyebrows rose. Before the round eyes of Monsieur Breden, he began to produce from his pockets and to lay upon the table banknotes and sovereigns. The cloth was covered with them. Paul picked up a half-sovereign. If monsieur, he said to the policeman, would accept this as a slight consolation for the inconvenience which this foolish person here has caused you. Not half, said Mr. Parsons affably. Look here. He turned to the gaping proprietor. If you go on like this, you'll be getting yourself into trouble, see? You take care another time. Paul called for the bill of fare. It was the inferior person who had succeeded to his place as waiter who attended to his needs during the meal. But when he had lunched, it was Jean who brought his coffee. She bent over the table. You sold your picture, Paul, yes? She whispered. For much money. How glad I am, dear Paul. Now we will... Paul met her glance coolly. Will you be so kind, he said, as to bring me also a cigarette? my good girl? End of story number 6, Rough-Hew Them How We Will, recording by Mike Harris.